Have you ever read the opening chapters of Genesis and felt like there's something deeper hiding beneath the surface? You might have noticed that, at first glance, these passages seem to describe mankind's creation in a way that doesn't fully make sense. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, at least on the surface, appear to tell two versions of the same story. But what if they're not telling the same story at all? What if the first chapters of Genesis are actually revealing two separate creations, one spiritual and one physical, each offering a profound insight into the nature of humanity, the divine, and our very purpose in the world? Many people, for centuries, have read these familiar words without recognizing the hidden truths beneath them. Even those who are well-versed in biblical teachings may have missed the subtle difference between the two creations. But if we start to see the story of Genesis through a different lens, it might change the way we understand our own identity. What if humanity was not just created as a singular race or form, but was instead designed in two different ways, one spiritual, the other earthly? This might explain the tension many of us feel between our higher purpose and our human limitations. The more you look into this, the more it seems that the secret of Genesis may hold the key to unlocking the very essence of who we are. In Genesis 1, we encounter creation that is beyond the physical realm. The Bible tells us that God created humanity in His image, male and female. Yet this creation isn't about physical form. It's not about hands molding dust or breathing life into clay. The word used here, bara, speaks of a creation from nothing, a divine act of will and intention. In other words, this wasn't a physical shaping, but a spiritual declaration. Before Adam and Eve were formed from dust, humanity existed as a spiritual reflection of God. This wasn't just a creation of bodies, but of souls, beings made in the image of Elohim, the God of divine plurality. This first humanity was not confined to a garden or bound by earthly limits. It was given a global, cosmic mission to fill the earth and exercise dominion. What's intriguing here is that Genesis 1 does not describe a fall or failure. The humans created in this chapter were pure, untarnished by sin, and meant for greatness. They were not placed in a garden, but were sent out into the vastness of the world to multiply and govern. Yet, after this creation, the Bible moves on to a very different account in Genesis 2, where God forms Adam from the dust and places him in the garden. This shift in tone raises a critical question. If Genesis 1 describes a spiritual humanity, then what is the purpose of Genesis 2? Why would God need to create humanity again, this time from clay, and with a different purpose, one tied to the earth, with boundaries, choices, and a very specific mission? In Genesis 2, the creation story takes on a completely different atmosphere. Here, God doesn't merely declare humanity into existence with a word. Instead, He forms Adam from the dust of the ground, breathing life into him. The Hebrew word used here, yatsar, implies a delicate, intimate shaping, as if God is a potter working with clay. This isn't just a process of creation. It's communion. God's hands are involved in the formation of humanity, and His breath gives life to Adam. This marks a shift from a cosmic Elohim of Genesis 1 to the more personal Yahweh Elohim, the Lord God who is close, near, and relational. It's not just that God created mankind. He shaped them with care and breathed His very life into them, giving them a living soul. Adam's creation wasn't an act of mass production. It was a deeply personal act, a direct interaction between Creator and creation. And as we see Adam placed in the garden, we realize that this new humanity is different from the one in Genesis 1. The humans of Genesis 1 were created for a vast, expansive mission to fill and rule the earth. But Adam's creation in Genesis 2 comes with a more localized purpose, to tend and keep the garden. In a sense, Adam's task is more about care, responsibility, and relationship, while the humans of Genesis 1 were tasked with cosmic stewardship. But there's a twist. This second creation is not flawless. Adam is alone in the garden, and God recognizes that something is missing. Adam is incomplete, and the story takes a turn when God creates Eve from Adam's side, marking the beginning of companionship, partnership, and the foundation of humanity's relational nature. What's important to note here is that Genesis 2 doesn't just show us the creation of a man and a woman. It also introduces a concept of choice, conflict, and, ultimately, the possibility of falling. The garden, though a place of beauty and intimacy with God, is also a place of testing. Adam and Eve are given freedom, but with it comes responsibility. They are placed before the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they are given a choice to obey God or to reach beyond the boundaries set for them. This is the crucial difference from Genesis 1, where the spiritual humanity created in the image of Elohim had no such limitations or temptations. The humans of Genesis 2, however, are not just created. They are chosen, tasked with learning obedience and trust. And as we know, they fail that test. The fall happens, and the tension between spirit and flesh, between divine calling and earthly desires, begins. This fall doesn't mark the end. However, despite their disobedience, Adam and Eve's story doesn't conclude with their rejection. Instead, God provides garments for them, covering their shame, and sends them out not as a punishment but as a purpose. Even in their brokenness, they are still part of God's greater plan, and their journey continues. The Genesis 2 account highlights a critical lesson. Even though humanity falls short, there is still hope for redemption. We may struggle with our earthly desires, our weaknesses, and the consequences of our choices, but this doesn't change the fact that we were created with purpose. In the tension of our humanity, between the divine light we were created in and the dust we are bound to, God still works. Adam and Eve's failure becomes a gateway through which humanity's redemption is revealed. And this pattern of falling and rising is seen throughout the rest of the Bible. Now, the question arises, if Genesis 1 speaks of a spiritual humanity and Genesis 2 speaks of a physical one, how do these two creations relate to each other? Could it be that the humans described in Genesis 1, the spiritual beings created in God's image, existed before Adam and Eve? Perhaps these early creations were not bound by time and space, but were spiritual entities made for a different purpose. Some scholars suggest that the spiritual humanity in Genesis 1 was a different creation altogether, one that was not subject to the same limitations of the physical realm. But if this is the case, then what happened to these beings? Where did they go? And how does the fall of Adam and Eve in Genesis 2 relate to the spiritual beings created in Genesis 1? Elohim had already been sent out into the world to multiply and fill the earth. Their existence could explain the strange details in the story of Cain, when he expresses fear of being killed by others after murdering Abel. If there were only 4 humans on the earth at that time, Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel, then who were these others Cain feared? Some ancient Jewish interpretations suggest that the spiritual humans of Genesis 1 had already populated the earth before Adam and Eve were placed in the garden. This raises the intriguing idea that Cain's exile wasn't into an empty wilderness, but into a world already inhabited by another creation, one that existed before the physical creation of Adam and Eve. This idea opens up a fascinating possibility. What if Cain's fear was not simply about divine punishment, but also about being cast out into a world that was fundamentally different from the one he knew? After all, Cain's world was formed from dust and breath, shaped by the intimate hands of Yahweh Elohim. But what about the world outside the garden? What if the spiritual beings of Genesis 1 had already spread across the earth, fulfilling God's command to multiply and subdue the world? When Cain was cast out of Eden, perhaps he wasn't just fleeing a physical consequence. He was stepping into a world where spiritual beings and earthly beings coexisted, creating a tension between these two creations. The mystery deepens when we consider the idea that Cain eventually finds a wife. Yet, the text doesn't explain where she comes from. It doesn't mention Adam and Eve having any daughters at that point, which leaves us to wonder, who is she? Some ancient texts, including the Midrash and the Dead Sea Scrolls, suggest that the two creations, spiritual and physical, were not entirely separate. Rather, they may have interacted, intermingled, or even coexisted in some way. If Genesis 1 represents spiritual humanity and Genesis 2 represents physical humanity, then could Cain's wife have been one of the beings created in the spiritual image of Elohim? And if this is the case, what does it say about the relationship between these two types of humans and the consequences of their interaction? As we delve deeper into this idea, we start to see that Cain may not only represent the first murderer in history, but also the first bridge between two worlds, the spiritual and the physical. When God marks Cain to protect him from others, it may not have been just about protecting him from random violence. It could have been a divine signal to distinguish him from other humans, perhaps those from the Genesis 1 creation. This mark could have been a form of protection for Cain, ensuring that those who have been created spiritually in Elohim's image would recognize him as part of the same lineage, despite his transgression. It's fascinating to think that Cain, though marked by a curse, was still protected by God's hand. A reminder that even in our brokenness, there is divine mercy. This brings us to the powerful theme that runs through the entire Genesis account. Even in failure, there is purpose. The fall of Adam and Eve does not erase the divine plan. Rather, it propels humanity into a deeper story, one that involves learning, growing, and eventually redemption. Cain's exile into a world already populated by spiritual beings suggests that God's creation is more layered than we often realize. His act of marking Cain could be seen as the beginning of a new phase for humanity, one where spiritual and physical beings are not so easily divided. As the story continues to unfold, we see that Cain's line, though marked by violence and brokenness, begins to build cities, create culture, and invent tools. In the same way, our own journeys, though marked by our mistakes, can also lead to growth and purpose. As we consider the continued story of Cain and his descendants, it becomes clear that even in their exile, God's purposes were still at work. Cain's descendants began to create civilization, introducing music, tools, and culture to the world. This is a profound truth. Even in brokenness, God's plan continues. Cain, the first murderer, doesn't simply vanish into obscurity. His line carries forward, shaping the world in ways that were both unexpected and transformative. This echoes a key theme in the biblical narrative. God is always working, even through our failures, to bring about his larger story of redemption. However, there's a tension in this narrative that we can't ignore. If the Genesis 1 creation represents a spiritual humanity and the Genesis 2 creation represents a physical humanity, what happens when these two worlds collide? Some scholars suggest that this collision is seen most clearly in the story in the film in Genesis 6, where the sons of God, often interpreted as the spiritual beings from Genesis 1, take the daughters of men, the descendants of Adam and Eve, as wives. This union results in the birth of the Nephilim, mighty beings who, in some traditions, are seen as giants or hybrid creatures. It's a moment where the tension between the spiritual and the physical, the light and the dust, becomes undeniable. This collision between the two creations continues to echo throughout Scripture as we see humanity, caught between these two natures, wrestle with their divine calling and their earthly struggles. From the very beginning, we've been caught between two worlds, one that is divine and spiritual, and another that is earthly and physical. This duality can be seen in the lives of many biblical figures, like Abraham, who was called out of his people to become a father of a new nation, Moses, raised in the palace of Pharaoh yet chosen to lead Israel out of slavery, and ultimately Jesus, who embodies both the divine and the human natures perfectly. Each of these figures stands as a reflection of the tension between our spiritual origin and our earthly reality. And in a way, we too are living between these two worlds, our higher calling, which draws us toward the divine, and our human nature, which often pulls us back into the dust. This theme of duality, between light and dust, spirit and flesh, divine and earthly, continues to shape our understanding of ourselves. As we wrestle with our own identities, we find ourselves asking, which world do I belong to? This question isn't just about where we came from, but about where we're headed. Are we living as if we were only made of clay? Or are we embracing the truth that we were also made from light? Genesis doesn't just tell the story of where we came from. It reveals who we are and who we are meant to become. The beauty of this story lies in the fact that both the divine and the earthly parts of us are woven together into one complex, unique human story. The revelation of these two creations, one spiritual and one physical, changes the way we view our own struggles and challenges. If you've ever felt torn between your higher calling and your human weaknesses, then you're not alone. This internal battle is part of the human experience, and it's something that began at the very dawn of creation. The first humans, Adam and Eve, were placed in the garden to cultivate and tend it, but they were also given the freedom to choose to obey or disobey. This choice, this tension between divine purpose and human frailty, echoes throughout the entire biblical narrative. It's a theme that speaks to the heart of what it means to be human. We are not just the sum of our actions, but the sum of our potential, our choices, and the grace that covers our failures. In a sense, the story of Adam and Eve is not just about their fall. It's about the journey we all take. It's about the human experience of living between two natures, the divine image we were created in and the dust we are bound to. Every day, we face the choice to live according to our spiritual calling or to give in to our earthly desires. And like Adam and Eve, we often fail. But the message of Genesis and the message of the entire Bible is that failure does not disqualify us from our divine purpose. In fact, it's through our weaknesses and struggles that we often come to understand the depth of God's grace and redemption. This truth is not just historical. It is deeply personal, and is what allows us to find hope even in our darkest moments. This journey of understanding our dual nature, spiritual and earthly, also leads us to profound realization that we are never truly alone in our struggle. Throughout the Bible, we see a consistent theme of God's presence amidst human frailty. Even after Adam and Eve's fall, God didn't abandon them. Instead, He covered them, marked them, and sent them out with a purpose. This act of grace points us towards something larger. God is not simply the Creator who forms us. He is also the Redeemer who walks with us through every difficulty and failure. His work of shaping and calling us doesn't end with our first creation. Instead, it continues through our journey of redemption, teaching us to rise after every fall, to choose love after every mistake, and to see ourselves not just as broken beings, but as part of His larger story of restoration. This narrative of continual redemption and restoration can also be seen in the lives of biblical heroes like David, Moses, and even Jesus. Each one of them, in their own way, reflected the tension between the spiritual and the earthly, between the divine calling and the human struggle. David, despite his failures, was still called a man after God's own heart. Moses, though he was reluctant and flawed, became the deliverer of Israel. Jesus, fully divine and fully human, demonstrated the ultimate reconciliation of these two natures. And in doing so, He gave us a model for how we can live, embracing both our divine potential and our human limitations, knowing that God works through both to bring about His plan. The message that runs through the Genesis creation story and through the entire Bible is that we are not defined by our failures, our shortcomings, or our past mistakes. The story of Adam and Eve is not just about the origin of humanity. It is about how we are shaped, tested, and ultimately redeemed through God's love and grace. It's about how, even in our moments of deepest brokenness, God continues to call us, shape us, and renew us. Genesis 1 and 2 are not just separate accounts. They are two parts of the same divine plan, showing us the tension between our spiritual origins and our earthly existence. This tension doesn't exist to condemn us, but to remind us of our divine purpose and the continual work of God in our lives. We can see this pattern again and again throughout Scripture. When we fall, God doesn't discard us. Instead, He picks us up, covers us, and sends us out with a renewed sense of purpose. Adam and Eve's journey wasn't over when they left the garden. Similarly, our story doesn't end when we fall short or when we face challenges. God's plan for us includes both our creation in His image and our redemption through His grace. As we continue to walk through life, caught between our higher calling and our earthly struggles, we must remember that the story is not over. Just as Adam and Eve were given a chance to rise after their fall, so too are we given that same opportunity. As we reflect on this, it becomes clear that our struggles with identity, purpose, and the tension between our higher calling and our human nature are not just part of our personal journey. They are part of the larger cosmic story that began in Genesis. From the very beginning, humanity has been caught between two worlds. The world of divine intention, where we are made in God's image, and the world of earthly reality, where we are bound to dust. This duality is what defines the human experience. Yet, it's in this very tension, between light and dust, spirit and flesh, that our true potential is revealed. We are not just beings made from clay. We are beings with a divine calling, created in the image of Elohim, yet living in a physical world that constantly challenges us to live out that calling. The story of Genesis, then, is not just about the past. It is a reflection of our present reality. We live in a world where the echoes of our spiritual creation continue to call us forward, even as our earthly struggles try to pull us back. The spiritual humanity of Genesis 1 is not lost. It continues to live within us, calling us to remember our divine origin, our higher purpose. At the same time, the earthly humanity of Genesis 2 teaches us the importance of growth, choice, and redemption. The balance between these two parts of our nature is what allows us to fully understand our true identity, not just as beings formed from dust, but as beings with divine calling, created for a purpose that transcends the physical world. As we continue to reflect on the implications of these two creations, it becomes evident that understanding our identity is key to living out our purpose. We are beings created from both light and dust, both spirit and clay. This truth, hidden in plain sight in the opening chapters of Genesis, invites us to look deeper into ourselves. If we only focus on the earthly aspects of our existence, the struggles, the pain, the limitations, we miss the greater truth about who we really are. We are more than our mistakes, our failures, and the dust of the earth. We are reflections of divine image, created with a higher calling, made to reflect God's glory and carry His purpose into the world. What does this mean for us in practical terms? It means that we're not just surviving, we are here to thrive. When we understand that we were created with a divine purpose, formed in God's image, yet placed in an earthly reality, we begin to see the potential in every aspect of our lives. Even in the challenges and struggles, there is an opportunity to fulfill our calling. The journey of Adam and Eve, marked by both their creation and their fall, shows us that even in our brokenness, God's plan is still at work. Our failures do not define us. They become part of our story of redemption. It is through the tension between light and dust, spirit and flesh, that we can fully experience the transformative power of God's love and grace. As we continue this journey through Genesis, we begin to see that the two creations, spiritual and physical, are not just separate entities, but two aspects of the same divine plan. The struggle between light and dust, spirit and flesh, is not something we are meant to overcome in isolation. Instead, it is through the tension between these two natures that we find our true purpose. The story of Adam and Eve teaches us that our highest potential is realized when we embrace both aspects of our being. Yes, we are made from dust, but we are also made in the image of God, and that divine image still resides within us, even when we fail. This understanding can shift the way we live our everyday lives. If we only focus on the physical, on our struggles, limitations, and failures, we might miss the bigger picture of who we are meant to become. But when we remember our spiritual creation, we understand that our true identity is rooted in something much deeper. We are not just people bound by flesh and circumstances. We are children of the divine, made to fulfill a greater purpose. It's in our failures, our struggles, and our growth that we discover the divine potential within us. And this potential is not limited to our earthly reality. We are called to live out the image of Elohim, reflecting His light and purpose, no matter the challenges we face. In recognizing the tension between our spiritual and earthly natures, we can begin to live with a new understanding of our place in the world. The duality described in Genesis, spiritual beings created in the image of Elohim and physical beings formed from dust by Yahweh Elohim, points to the reality that we are always navigating between these two realms. This tension isn't something to escape. It is something to embrace. In our daily lives, we often find ourselves torn between our divine potential and our human limitations, between the light we were created in and the dust we are bound to. But it is through this very tension that we grow, learn, and evolve into who we were always meant to be. The Bible doesn't shy away from this duality. It presents it as a central theme of the human experience. Whether we're reading about Cain and Abel, Moses and Pharaoh, or even Jesus Christ, we see this continual push and pull between the spiritual and the earthly. This struggle is not a contradiction. It's a necessary part of our journey. It teaches us that life is not just about achieving perfection, but about learning, growing, and rising again after every fall. The creation story in Genesis invites us to see that we are more than our earthly struggles. We are divine beings, created for a higher purpose. And even when we fall, there is always redemption and the promise of a new beginning. As we continue to explore the depths of Genesis, we come to understand that this story is not just about our origins, but about the continuous journey of becoming. The tension between the spiritual and the earthly isn't just a part of our past. It's part of who we are today. Every day, we navigate between these two realms. Our divine calling, which urges us towards something greater, and our human nature, which keeps us grounded in the here and now. This balance isn't always easy to maintain, and sometimes, like Adam and Eve, we fall. But it's through these moments of failure and growth that we truly learn the depth of our potential. The beauty of the story of Adam and Eve is not that they were perfect, but that they were chosen, even in their imperfection. Their story mirrors our own because we too are created with both divine potential and earthly limitations. But God doesn't reject us in our failures. He redeems us. He doesn't discard us when we fall short. He calls us back to himself, covering our mistakes, and continues to shape us through the process. This is a profound truth embedded in the creation story. God is still at work in us, forming us, refining us, and calling us into something greater than we could imagine. The tension between light and dust, spirit and flesh, is not something that condemns us. It's something that makes us human, and through that humanity, God is doing a mighty work. In light of all this, we must ask ourselves, what do we do with the tension between our spiritual origin and our earthly existence? How do we live fully, acknowledging both our divine calling and our human weaknesses? The answer isn't to choose one over the other, but to embrace both with humility and faith. We are not just spiritual beings, nor are we just physical beings. We are a beautiful combination of both. In understanding and accepting this, we can begin to live with purpose, knowing that our spiritual calling is just as important as our earthly responsibilities. The journey of Adam and Eve teaches us that growth happens through the tension, through the struggle between what we are meant to be and what we are right now. Living in the tension doesn't mean we're failing. It means we're learning. Every challenge we face, every moment of doubt or struggle, is an opportunity to refine our character, to strengthen our faith, and to grow into the people God created us to be. In the midst of our earthly struggles, we can still hold on to our divine purpose. Even when we feel caught between the light of our spiritual calling and the dust of our human nature, we can trust that God is working in both realms. Our failures don't cancel our destiny. They're part of our story of redemption. Just as Adam and Eve's story didn't end in the garden, neither does ours. God is still shaping us, still breathing life into us, and still calling us to fulfill our purpose in the world. As we move forward, it's important to recognize that the story of Genesis isn't just ancient history. It's a reflection of our ongoing journey. The lessons embedded in the creation of humanity, both spiritual and physical, speak to the very essence of who we are today. The tension we experience between our higher calling and our earthly struggles is something every person faces. It's in our brokenness, in our moment of doubt and failure, that we truly understand the depth of God's grace and redemption. Adam and Eve's journey was just a beginning, and their story echoes through every human life, reminding us that we are not simply defined by our mistakes, but by our potential to rise again. It's this potential, rooted in our divine creation, that gives us hope. Even when we feel distant from our higher calling, when the way of the world pulls us down, we are still made in the image of Elohim. Our identity is not defined by our earthly struggles, but by the divine breath that was breathed into us at the moment of our creation. As we navigate our daily lives, it's essential to keep this truth in mind. We are both light and dust, spirit and flesh. Embracing this duality and trusting that God is at work in both allows us to live with purpose, knowing that our story, like Adam and Eve's, has a greater meaning. We are not just surviving. We are here to thrive, to grow, and fulfill the divine mission God set before us from the very beginning. The truth we see in Genesis is that our lives are not random. We are part of a much larger narrative. Each of us is intricately woven into the fabric of God's creation, carrying within us both the image of Elohim and the breath of Yahweh. This duality is essential to understanding who we truly are. It helps us navigate the complexity of our lives, where we feel the pull between our divine purpose and our human limitations. Just as Adam and Eve were placed in the garden with a specific task, we too are placed where we are for a reason. Our mission, however small or grand it may seem, is significant in God's eyes. Every day we live is an opportunity to reflect His light and fulfill our divine calling, even as we face the challenges of our earthly existence. Genesis teaches us that we are both made from dust and destined for glory. Our human experience is a constant reminder that even in our imperfection, God continues to shape us and call us to His purposes. And just like Adam and Eve, when we fall, we are not discarded. God does not abandon us in our failures. He covers us, redeems us, and continues His work in us. It's a story of hope, a reminder that no matter how far we feel from our divine origin, we can always return. The tension between light and dust, between spirit and flesh, is not something that diminishes us. It strengthens us. Through this struggle, we discover more about who we are and what we were created to do. Our journey is just beginning, and God is still at work in us, shaping us into who we are meant to be. The beauty of the Genesis story is that it doesn't leave us in a place of failure or defeat. While Adam and Eve's fall introduced pain and separation, it also set the stage for something incredible: redemption. Even in their exile, God didn't abandon humanity. He set in motion a plan to restore us. And this plan isn't just about the past. It's something that continues to unfold in our lives today. Every time we face struggles or doubts, we have the opportunity to remember that our story doesn't end in defeat. Just as God breathed life into Adam and Eve, He continues to breathe life into us, calling us back to our divine purpose and reminding us of our true identity. The journey from creation to fall and back to redemption is a pattern that runs through the entire Bible, from Genesis to Revelation. It's the story of humanity, not defined by its failures, but by the grace of God that meets us in our brokenness. When we embrace the tension between our spiritual origins and our earthly reality, we find that the divine breath within us is still active. It's calling us to rise, to fulfill the purpose for which we were created, and to reflect God's image to the world. Whether we're in the garden, in exile, or facing the struggles of everyday life, the promise remains: God is still shaping us, still redeeming us, and still using us for His glory. As we embrace this dual nature, we begin to see that our struggles and challenges are not just random occurrences. They are opportunities for growth. Each moment of difficulty is a chance to understand more about our divine purpose and how God is working through us. Just as Adam and Eve were placed in the garden to tend and care for it, we are also placed in our own gardens, our families, our communities, our workplaces, to cultivate, to care, and to reflect God's image. Even though we are bound by human limitations, we still carry within us a potential to do extraordinary things. The dust we are made from doesn't limit us. It's a reminder that God can use even the most ordinary, earthly things to accomplish His divine purposes. The journey of Adam and Eve shows us that growth doesn't come without struggle. They were placed in a paradise, yet they still faced temptation and made a choice that led to their fall. But even in their failure, God's redemptive plan was set in motion. This is a story of humanity, not a story of perfection, but of learning, growing, failing, and being redeemed. And as we walk through our own lives, we are given the same opportunity to choose obedience, to choose to rise after we fall, and to choose to live according to the higher calling God has placed within us. Our journey, like theirs, is filled with both light and dust, but it is through this journey that we discover who we truly are and what we are capable of when we allow God to shape us. As we reflect on the entire creation narrative, we begin to realize that the tension between light and dust, spirit and flesh, is not something to be feared or avoided. It is a part of God's perfect design. We were made to navigate this tension, to wrestle with our higher calling and our earthly nature, and in doing so, to grow into the fullness of who we are meant to be. The story of Genesis teaches us that we are both divinely created and deeply human, and that both aspects are essential to our identity. We are not defined by our failures or our struggles. We are defined by the divine breath that sustains us, by the calling God has placed on our lives, and by the redemptive work He continues to do within us. This understanding transforms the way we view our daily lives and challenges. We are not just people trying to survive. We are people created with purpose, formed by God to reflect His image in the world. No matter where we find ourselves, whether in a moment of triumph or failure, we are part of God's ongoing work of creation and redemption. And just as Adam and Eve were given a new purpose after their fall, so too are we given the opportunity to rise, to be redeemed, and fulfill the calling God has placed on our lives. The journey from light to dust and back again is the story of humanity, and it's the story we continue to live today. In the end, we discover that our greatest purpose lies not in perfection, but in walking with God through both the light and the dust, reflecting His glory in everything we do.